The boardroom on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling glass. It was designed for confidence. For dominance. For deals that moved millions with a single nod. But that morning, it felt like a courtroom. Daniel Mercer sat at the long black table, hands folded, watching the city stretch beneath him like a circuit board of glass and steel. 20 years inside this company had taught him one thing. When the board called an unscheduled executive meeting, something was already decided. The chairman cleared his throat. "Daniel. Thank you for coming in on short notice." That was the first lie of the morning. He hadn't been invited. He'd been summoned. Across the table sat 8 directors and the CEO, Claire Whitaker. She avoided his eyes, flipping through a printed packet she clearly had no intention of reading. Daniel noticed the details. A legal folder. An HR representative he had never seen before. Security waiting outside the glass doors. So this was how it would happen. The chairman slid a document across the table. "After careful consideration, the board has decided to terminate your position as chief systems architect, effective immediately." The words were calm. Polished. Pre-approved by lawyers. Daniel didn't touch the paper. Instead, he slowly leaned back in his chair. "Careful consideration," he repeated. The room stayed silent. The chairman continued. "As the company evolves, we believe it's time to move in a new technological direction." Daniel almost laughed. New direction. For 20 years he had built the infrastructure that allowed this company to function. Not just the software. Not just the servers. Everything. Payroll automation. Inventory routing. Client authentication. Security permissions. Disaster recovery. Every invisible system that made the company look effortless from the outside. He looked at Claire. "Did you vote for this?" Her jaw tightened. "It's a board decision." Which meant yes. Another director spoke up, a younger man who had joined only 8 months earlier. "We've hired a consulting firm to modernize operations. They'll be implementing a more scalable architecture." Daniel nodded slowly. "Of course you did. Consultants. The corporate equivalent of demolition crews." The chairman pushed the paper closer. "If you'll sign the separation agreement, HR will walk you through the transition." Daniel still didn't touch it. Instead, he asked a single question. "Who explained the system to them?" The younger director smirked. "They're experts, Daniel." That answer told him everything. No one had explained anything. Because no one actually understood it. Not really, the company's systems weren't a neat diagram on a whiteboard. They were 20 years of architecture built layer by layer, optimized, hardened, protected. Hundreds of interdependent processes. Thousands of automated decisions happening every second. The kind of system that didn't break. Unless someone tried to replace the person who built it. Daniel finally picked up the paper. He didn't read it. He signed. The scratch of the pen sounded loud in the silent room. The chairman nodded toward the door. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings." Daniel stood. No anger. No argument. That seemed to bother them more than anything. As he walked toward the door, he paused and turned back. One last look at the room. 8 people who believed they had just solved a problem. "You should call the consultants," Daniel said calmly. The chairman frowned. "Why?" Daniel opened the glass door. "Because in about." He checked his watch. 6 hours, you're going to start seeing things stop working." The younger director scoffed. "That sounds like a threat." Daniel shook his head. "No." A faint smile crossed his face. "It's a prediction." Then he walked out. Security followed him down the silent hallway toward the elevators. Behind him, inside the boardroom, the directors began talking again, confident, relieved, already moving on. They believed the system would keep running. After all. It always had. What they didn't realize was something Daniel had understood for years. The company didn't run on software. It ran on his understanding of it. And for the first time in 2 decades. He was no longer there to keep it alive. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. 42 floors. The digital numbers ticked downward while Daniel Mercer stood silently beside 2 security guards who clearly wished they were somewhere else. One of them cleared his throat. "Sorry about this, sir." Daniel gave a small nod. "Not your decision." The elevator doors opened into the executive floor lobby. The hallway outside was unusually quiet, like a building holding its breath. Word traveled fast in corporate towers. People had already heard. As Daniel walked toward his office, employees glanced up from their desks. Some quickly looked away. Some pretended to type. A few watched openly, their faces filled with that strange mixture of curiosity and fear people feel when they witness power shift. Because if someone like Daniel Mercer could be fired, anyone could. His office door was already open. HR had beaten him there. A young woman stood beside a cardboard box on his desk. She offered the professional smile that HR training manuals probably recommended. "Mr. Mercer, I'll help you gather your personal belongings." Daniel stepped inside. 20 years of work lived in this room. Whiteboards filled with architecture sketches. Technical diagrams no one else could fully read. Books on distributed systems and security frameworks. And on the far wall, a framed photograph of the company's first data center. Back when the company had only 12 employees and a single rented server rack. Daniel picked up the frame. He remembered assembling that rack himself. Back when the CEO had brought him in and said, "We're going to build something big." And they had. But somewhere along the way, the people changed. He placed the photo carefully into the box. HR glanced at the whiteboard. Will someone need those diagrams? Daniel looked at the tangled architecture drawn across the board. Data flows. Failover triggers. Emergency bypass layers. Not unless they can read them, he said. She didn't ask what that meant. 10 minutes later, the box was full. Daniel picked it up and walked toward the elevator again. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed something interesting. People were watching more openly now. And not just employees. Executives. 3 of them stood near the conference room doors. One avoided eye contact immediately. Another gave him a stiff nod. But the third man smiled. Victor Hale. The new strategy director. 8 months in the company. 8 months of modernization initiatives. Victor's smile was polite. Too polite. Daniel, he said smoothly, walking over. Tough day. Daniel studied him. Victor had the relaxed confidence of someone whose plan had just succeeded. You must be the consultant whisperer, Daniel said. Victor chuckled lightly. Change is uncomfortable. But necessary. Daniel shifted the box in his arms. Tell me something, Victor. Victor tilted his head. Sure. Did the consultants explain how the authentication cascade connects to the logistics routing engine? Victor blinked once. A tiny pause. Almost invisible. I'm sure they'll sort out the technical details, he said. Daniel nodded slowly. Of course they hadn't. Victor leaned a little closer. You know, Daniel. Companies evolve. Sometimes the people who built the first version aren't the ones meant to lead the next one. There it was. Not anger. Not regret. Replacement. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that made Victor's smile tighten just slightly. You might want to ask them about the adaptive failover loops. Victor's brow creased. Adaptive what? Daniel stepped into the elevator. The doors began to close. Exactly, he said. 40 floors above them. Back in the boardroom. The directors had already moved on to the next agenda item. Quarterly projections. Consultant onboarding. System migration timelines. The chairman tapped his pen on the table. All right. Next topic. The CEO's phone buzzed. She glanced down. Then frowned. Another phone buzzed. Then another. Within seconds, 3 executives were checking their screens. The operations director looked up. That's strange. The chairman sighed. What now? The operations director turned his laptop toward the table. A red alert message blinked on the screen. Logistics routing service, temporary authorization failure. The chairman waved it off. Minor glitch. The operations director wasn't convinced. Except, the backup system didn't trigger. Across the table, Victor Hale leaned forward. Can't IT just reset it? The operations director hesitated. Well. He refreshed the screen. The error multiplied. 3 alerts. Then 5. Then 12. The room grew quieter. Why isn't the failover activating? Someone asked. No one had an answer. And 40 floors below. Daniel Mercer walked out of the building carrying a single cardboard box. Behind him, the company he had built for 2 decades had just experienced its first system failure in 15 years. And it was only the beginning. At first, the company called it a temporary disruption. That was the phrase used in the internal email sent to department heads 40 minutes after Daniel Mercer walked out of the building. We are experiencing a brief system irregularity affecting logistics routing. Our consultants are reviewing the architecture and will have a solution shortly. It sounded calm. Professional. Controlled. Unfortunately, the system itself had other plans. In the operations center 3 floors below the boardroom, screens covered an entire wall, real-time dashboards tracking every major function of the company. Inventory flow. Client transactions. Warehouse automation. Payment verification. For years those screens had looked almost boring. Green indicators. Stable numbers. Now small pockets of red alerts were beginning to appear. One of the engineers leaned closer to his monitor. That's weird. What? Another asked. The routing engine is rejecting verified orders. That makes no sense. They ran the check again. The same result. Orders that were already authenticated were suddenly flagged as authorization mismatch. One engineer pulled up the system logs. Wait. Why isn't the authentication cascade updating? Another frowned. It should trigger automatically. They checked the secondary system. Nothing. The tertiary layer. Still nothing. One of the consultants, brought in only 2 days earlier, walked over with a tablet. What's the issue? The engineer gestured at the screen. The routing engine isn't accepting verified credentials. The consultant typed quickly. That shouldn't happen. He opened the architecture diagram the consulting firm had created during their preliminary audit. A clean diagram. Boxes. Lines. Simple. Except the system running on the servers didn't look anything like that. One of the engineers said quietly. This diagram isn't accurate. The consultant frowned. It's based on the documentation provided by the company. Yeah, the engineer replied. About that. He turned his monitor so the consultant could see the real system logs. Hundreds of automated decisions were happening every second. Permissions flowing between departments. Data verification loops. Adaptive routing conditions. And buried deep inside the system. Something none of them recognized. A decision tree that kept rejecting the new consultant's override attempts. The consultant blinked. Who built this? The engineer answered without hesitation. Daniel Mercer. Back upstairs, the boardroom meeting had stopped. Everyone was now staring at a growing list of alerts. The operations director spoke carefully. Some subsystems are failing to verify each other. The chairman rubbed his temple. So fix it. It's not that simple. Victor Hale leaned forward. Why not? The operations director hesitated. Because the system isn't behaving like a normal architecture. The chairman looked annoyed. What does that mean? It means. He turned the laptop toward them. The system is making conditional decisions based on logic we don't fully understand. Victor frowned. Conditional decisions? The operations director nodded. Certain actions require authentication layers that aren't responding. Then bypass them. We tried. The director tapped another key. Another alert appeared. Fail of a routine not authorized. The chairman leaned back. Authorized by who? The operations director didn't answer right away. He scrolled through the system permissions. Then his expression changed. Wait. Victor leaned closer. What? The director pointed to a line of code that had just appeared in the logs. Root architect verification required. The room went silent. The chairman asked slowly. And who exactly is the root architect? The operations director looked up. You fired him about 2 hours ago. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Mercer sat in a quiet cafe with his laptop closed and a cup of coffee in front of him. He wasn't watching the news. He wasn't checking company emails. He simply sat there, thinking. Because he already knew what was happening inside that building. Not because he caused it. But because he understood something the board never had. The company's systems weren't just software. They were an ecosystem. And ecosystems didn't collapse immediately when something changed. First, they started showing stress. Tiny cracks. Tiny failures. Tiny decisions no longer being made correctly. Daniel checked his watch. 2 hours. Right on schedule. He took a sip of coffee. And somewhere across the city, another alert appeared inside the company's operations center. Then another. Then 10 more. The first glitch had just begun. Inside the operations center, the atmosphere had shifted from confusion to quiet panic. 3 consultants sat around a workstation surrounded by company engineers. Screens glowed with streams of system logs that no one seemed able to interpret. The lead consultant rubbed his forehead. This architecture doesn't make sense. One of the senior engineers leaned back in his chair. It makes perfect sense. The consultant looked up. Then explain it. The engineer turned his monitor so the consultants could see the deeper layers of the system. You're looking at the top layer, he said. That's just the interface. He pulled up another window. Then another. And another. Each layer revealed more logic beneath the surface. Authentication layers. Adaptive routing systems. Self-correcting verification loops. The consultant stared. How many subsystems are there? The engineer shrugged. No one knows exactly. You're joking. No. He leaned forward. Daniel built most of this himself over 20 years. Some parts were added during crises, some during expansions, some during security incidents. The consultant scrolled through the code. This isn't normal enterprise architecture. Nope. What is it then? The engineer gave a simple answer. Survival architecture. Years earlier. Long before the boardroom had glass walls and investor briefings. The company had been small. 12 employees. 1 rented server rack in a cramped data center. Daniel Mercer had been the only systems engineer. When systems broke, he fixed them. When clients increased, he expanded infrastructure. When cyber attacks hit during the company's first major contract, Daniel built security layers overnight that saved the entire operation. But every solution had a side effect. It made the system smarter. More interconnected. More adaptive. Daniel didn't build static software. He built a living architecture. One where systems monitored each other. Where failures triggered alternative pathways. Where permissions flowed dynamically based on trust models he personally designed. It wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. But it was incredibly resilient. Back in the present, the consultant stared at one section of code. What is this? The engineer leaned over. Oh. That. He pointed to a block labeled. Adaptive failover loop. The consultant read the logic. Wait. This isn't a backup system. No. What is it? It's a decision system. The consultant scrolled. It's analyzing behavioral patterns across departments. Correct. And rerouting operations based on trust scores? Yep. The consultant sat back. Why would someone build that? The engineer answered with a single sentence. Because humans make bad decisions during emergencies. Upstairs in the executive wing. The board was starting to feel the consequences. The operations director spoke carefully. We have a problem. The chairman sighed. You've said that 3 times already. This one's worse. Victor Hale crossed his arms. How bad? The director looked directly at him. Departments are losing access to each other. What do you mean? Financial verification can't confirm logistics approvals. Logistics can't verify client authentication. Victor frowned. That sounds like a permissions issue. That's what we thought. He turned the laptop around. But the system isn't denying access. Victor leaned closer. Then what is it doing? The director zoomed in on the log message. Trust validation pending. The chairman looked irritated. Pending approval from who? The operations director hesitated. Then answered. The root architect. The room went silent again. Victor leaned back slowly. So the system is waiting for someone who doesn't work here anymore. Yes. The chairman slammed his hand on the table. Override it. We tried. And? The director swallowed. It won't let us. Across the city. Daniel Mercer finally opened his laptop. Not to log into the company. That access had already been revoked. Instead, he opened a private folder filled with design documents. Personal backups. Architectural notes. Things he had kept for himself. Because deep down, he had always known this day might come. He opened one file titled, System Governance Layer. Inside it was a simple note he had written years earlier. If leadership ever loses sight of the mission, the system must slow them down long enough for the truth to surface. Daniel stared at the screen for a moment. Then he closed the laptop again. He wasn't sabotaging the company. He wasn't attacking it. The system was simply doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect the company from bad decisions. Even if those decisions came from the board itself. Inside the company headquarters. Another alert appeared on the operations dashboard. Then another. And another. But this time, the alert wasn't about logistics. Or permissions. Or routing failures. It was about something far more serious. Financial transaction validation halted. The system had just frozen the company's ability to move money. The boardroom no longer felt like a place for strategy. It felt like an emergency bunker. Phones buzzed constantly. Laptops were open everywhere. The calm rhythm of quarterly discussions had been replaced by sharp voices and overlapping questions. The operations director stood near the screen displaying the latest alerts. More red indicators had appeared. Many more. The chairman rubbed his forehead. Explain this again. The operations director pointed to the dashboard. The financial validation system has stopped processing transactions. Victor Hale frowned. That's impossible. Unfortunately, it isn't. What caused it? The director hesitated. Technically speaking, nothing. The chairman looked up sharply. Nothing? The system isn't crashing. It isn't broken. Then why is it stopped? The director took a breath. Because it's waiting. Victor leaned forward. For what? The director zoomed in on the system log. Governance verification required. The chairman stared at the screen. What does that mean? The director answered carefully. It means the system wants confirmation from the original architectural authority before executing high-risk financial actions. Victor scoffed. That's absurd. No, the director said quietly. It's intentional. Down in the operations center, the consultants were having a much less confident conversation. 3 of them sat in front of a massive architecture map now projected across the wall. The map had started simple. But the deeper they explored the system, the more complicated it became. New pathways appeared. Hidden dependencies. Subsystems communicating through logic they hadn't documented. One consultant shook his head. This system evolved. Another nodded. It wasn't built all at once. It was built in response to problems. The senior consultant leaned back in his chair. Exactly. He zoomed in on a section of the architecture. What we're seeing is 20 years of adaptive engineering. One of the company engineers spoke up. You're starting to understand. The consultant gestured to the screen. But there's no master blueprint. Not one we have. The consultant turned slowly. You mean Daniel had it? The engineer gave a small shrug. Daniel was the blueprint. Back upstairs, the board was trying to maintain control. The chairman tapped the table. All right. The consultants will fix it. The operations director looked uneasy. They're trying. Victor Hale crossed his arms confidently. That's what we hired them for. The director didn't respond. Instead, he opened a new alert window. Another subsystem just stopped responding. Victor sighed. Which one? The director hesitated before answering. Client authentication. The room went quiet. That affects. What exactly? The chairman asked. The director answered bluntly. Everything. Because if the system could no longer authenticate clients, the company couldn't process orders. Or approve transactions. Or release shipments. Within minutes, 3 department heads called the boardroom. Then 5. Then 10. Warehouse managers reported stalled shipments. Finance teams reported frozen payment approvals. Customer support lines were flooding with confused clients. Victor leaned toward the operations director. This is temporary. The director looked at him. I hope so. Victor pointed at the screen. Just restart the system. The director gave him a long look. That's not how this works. Why not? Because this system doesn't shut down. Victor frowned. Every system shuts down. The director shook his head slowly. Not this one. Across the city, the cafe had grown busier. Daniel Mercer sat at the same table, now with a second cup of coffee. He watched people moving through the afternoon rush. Normal life. Completely unaware that inside one of the largest companies in the city, the entire infrastructure was slowly grinding to a halt. Daniel's phone vibrated. Unknown number. He stared at the screen for a moment. Then declined the call. He already knew who it was. 5 minutes later the phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He silenced it. Because there was only one thing the board could do now. And it would take them a little longer to admit it. Back at headquarters, the senior consultant finally stood up from his workstation. He looked at the company engineers. Then at the architecture map covering the wall. Then at the growing list of system failures. He exhaled slowly. We have a serious problem. One of the engineers crossed his arms. What kind of problem? The consultant gave the only honest answer he had left. We don't know how to run this system. Upstairs in the boardroom, Victor Hale's phone rang. He answered immediately. Yes? He listened. His confident expression slowly faded. What do you mean you can't override it? A pause. Then Victor looked toward the chairman. His voice was quieter now. Because the system requires authorization from the original architect. The chairman's face hardened. There must be another way. Victor ended the call. For the first time that day. He didn't sound confident. There is one. The chairman leaned forward. What? Victor hesitated before saying the words the board never wanted to hear. We need to talk to Daniel. By late afternoon, the company was no longer experiencing a problem. It was experiencing a cascade. In the operations center, the giant dashboard wall had turned from mostly green to a chaotic mixture of yellow and red alerts. Every few seconds another system flagged an issue. Inventory synchronization delay. Shipment approval backlog. Client verification queue overflow. None of them looked catastrophic on their own. But together, they formed a chain reaction. A warehouse manager shouted into a headset 2 states away. I have 12 trucks waiting for release. The logistics operator tried to stay calm. The system hasn't authorized the shipment yet. It's been 40 minutes. I know. Across the room another employee called out. Payment processing is stuck in a verification loop. A third voice followed. Customer portal login requests are timing out. The senior consultant stood in the middle of the chaos staring at the wall of alerts. He whispered under his breath. This system is defending itself. One of the engineers overheard. It's not defending itself. The consultant looked over. Then what is it doing? The engineer gave a quiet answer. It's verifying trust. Upstairs, the boardroom had transformed into a crisis command center. The chairman paced slowly. How much damage are we talking about? The finance director answered without sugarcoating it. If financial processing remains frozen past tonight, we start missing contract deadlines. Victor Hale leaned forward. Which means? Penalty clauses. How much? The finance director tapped a few keys. Potentially tens of millions. The room fell silent. The chairman looked at the operations director. Restart the financial servers. The director shook his head. We tried that already. And? They came back online. That's good. The director continued. And then immediately locked themselves again. Victor frowned. Why? The director turned the screen toward them. System integrity review in progress. The chairman stared. What is it reviewing? Us. Downstairs, one of the consultants was digging deeper into the system's core logic. What's this? He zoomed into a previously hidden layer. A subsystem labeled Governance Monitor. He opened it. Rows of logic conditions appeared. Leadership changes. Authorization chains. Trust scoring. Operational anomalies. The consultant leaned forward. Wait. This thing is monitoring executive decisions. An engineer nodded. Yep. And adjusting system permissions accordingly? Correct. The consultant looked stunned. Daniel built a corporate immune system. The engineer shrugged. That's one way to describe it. Meanwhile, the company's customer support center was exploding. Calls were pouring in. Clients couldn't place orders. Existing shipments were stalled. Invoices weren't processing. One of the supervisors turned to another employee. Has this ever happened before? The employee shook his head. Not once. Back in the boardroom, Victor's phone buzzed again. He answered instantly. Yes. He listened for several seconds. Then slowly sat down. What? The chairman demanded. Victor spoke quietly. Client authentication just locked itself. The chairman froze. That's the gateway system. Yes. If that fails, nothing moves. The chairman slammed his hand on the table. Fix it. Victor looked up. His confidence from earlier that morning was completely gone. We can't. The chairman's voice dropped dangerously. Why not? Victor hesitated. Then said the sentence no one wanted to hear. Because the system thinks we're the threat. Across the city, the evening sun reflected off the cafe windows. Daniel Mercer finally turned his phone back on. Immediately it lit up with notifications. 17 missed calls. 6 voicemails. 3 messages from unknown executives. He smiled faintly. The timeline had accelerated. He opened one voicemail. It was the operations director. His voice sounded tense. Daniel. We need to talk. Call me back. Daniel closed the message. Then opened his laptop again. Not to interfere, not to attack. Just to review something he had written years earlier. A design principle buried inside the governance system. If leadership actions threaten operational stability, slow the system until accountability returns. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He had written that rule after the company's first major internal scandal a decade ago. At the time, the board had thanked him for protecting the company. Ironically, the same protection was now stopping them. Back at headquarters, the consultants had reached their final conclusion. The senior consultant walked into the boardroom. Everyone turned toward him. Well? The chairman asked. The consultant didn't soften it. You fired the only person who understands the system. Victor leaned forward. So bring in another architect. The consultant shook his head slowly. That's not possible. Why not? He pointed at the dashboard filled with alerts. Because the system doesn't recognize anyone else as authorized to run it. The chairman asked quietly. What happens if we don't fix this soon? The consultant didn't hesitate. Within 12 hours, the company stops functioning. Across the city, Daniel's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a familiar name. Claire Whitaker, CEO. Daniel stared at the screen. For a long moment. Then he let it ring. Night had fallen over the city. Inside the company headquarters, almost no one had gone home. The bright executive floors that normally emptied at 6 were still fully lit. Engineers, consultants, and department heads moved through the hallways with the tense urgency of people trying to stop a slow-moving disaster. In the operations center, the alert wall was now almost entirely red. Not catastrophic failures, but endless verification delays. Requests waiting for approvals that never came. Authorizations looping through logic pathways that ultimately returned the same message. Root architect verification required. Upstairs, the boardroom had gone quiet. Hours earlier, it had been full of confident voices and decisive orders. Now it felt smaller. Heavier. The chairman sat at the head of the table staring at his phone. Claire Whitaker, the CEO, stood near the window looking down at the city lights. Victor Hale paced slowly. Finally, the chairman spoke. Have you reached him yet? Claire turned from the window. He declined the call. Victor scoffed. Then call again. I did. And? He didn't answer. Victor stopped pacing. Well then we escalate. The chairman looked up. How? Victor crossed his arms. Offer him his job back. Claire shook her head. It won't be that simple. Victor frowned. Why not? Claire looked directly at him. Because Daniel Mercer isn't stupid. Across the city, Daniel was walking along the river. The night air was cool. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. Hello. There was a brief pause. Then Claire's voice. Daniel. He stopped walking. Hello, Claire. For a moment neither of them spoke. Finally Claire said what she had clearly rehearsed. We need your help. Daniel almost laughed. That was fast. Do you? You know we do. How bad is it? Another pause. Worse than we expected. Daniel leaned against the railing overlooking the water. The governance layer locked you out, didn't it? Claire exhaled slowly. Yes. That means the trust metrics dropped. Yes. Which means the system believes leadership decisions are destabilizing operations. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. You built it that way? Yes. Another long silence. Claire finally said it. We want you to come back. Daniel's voice remained calm. In what capacity? As chief systems architect. The position you eliminated this morning. Claire didn't answer. Daniel continued. And what about the consultants? They're still here. And Victor? Claire hesitated. He's part of the leadership team. Daniel nodded even though she couldn't see him. Then the answer is no. Claire's voice sharpened slightly. Daniel, this isn't about pride. You're right. It's about the company. Yes. Thousands of employees rely on us. I know. Then help us fix this. Daniel looked out over the dark river. For 20 years I warned the board about reckless decisions. Claire said nothing. I warned you about short-term thinking. Still silence. I warned you about putting strategy ahead of stability. Claire spoke softly. You're right. Daniel hadn't expected that. She continued. But right now the company is bleeding. I know. If the system doesn't unlock soon, we'll start breaching contracts tomorrow morning. Daniel checked the time. You have about 9 hours. Claire sounded stunned. You know the timeline? I wrote the escalation model. Another pause. Then Claire asked the question that had been building all evening. Daniel, did you design this to happen? He answered immediately. No. Then why is the system doing this? Daniel spoke quietly. Because it's doing exactly what it was built to do. Back at headquarters, Victor leaned over the boardroom table. What did he say? Claire ended the call. He said no. The chairman's face darkened. That's unacceptable. Victor shook his head. He's bluffing. Claire looked at him sharply. You don't understand him. Victor smirked. Oh, I understand him perfectly. Do you? Yes. Victor leaned forward confidently. He's an engineer. So? So he cares about systems working. Claire folded her arms. And? And eventually he'll come back to fix it. The room was quiet. Then the operations director entered the boardroom carrying a tablet. You should see this. He placed it on the table. Another system alert had appeared. But this one was different. The message wasn't a failure notice. It was a system notification. Governance review stage 2 initiated. The chairman looked up. What does stage 2 mean? The operations director swallowed. It means the system believes the situation is getting worse. Victor frowned. And what happens in stage 3? The director looked directly at him. Full operational lockdown. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel's phone buzzed again. But this time it wasn't Claire. It was a message from an old colleague who still worked inside the company. The message contained just one line. You should see what the system just uncovered. Attached was a screenshot from the governance monitor. Daniel opened it. And for the first time that night, his calm expression disappeared. Because the system hadn't just been monitoring operations. It had been monitoring the board. And it had found something buried deep in their recent decisions. Something that explained why Daniel had really been fired. Daniel stared at the screenshot on his phone. For a long moment, he didn't move. The governance monitor screen showed something he hadn't expected to see this soon. A pattern analysis report. The system had detected abnormal leadership decisions over the past 8 months. That alone wasn't unusual. The monitor flagged irregular decisions all the time. It was part of the system's self-protection. But this report was different. It had escalated to executive integrity review. Daniel zoomed in. Transaction approvals. Asset transfers. Authorization overrides. All connected to one name. Victor Hale. Daniel's eyes narrowed. 8 months earlier, Victor had arrived at the company with glowing recommendations and a reputation as a corporate efficiency specialist. The board loved him immediately. He spoke their language. Optimization. Restructuring. Aggressive growth. Within weeks he began pushing for structural changes. Departments were reorganized. Budget allocations shifted. And most importantly, he began pushing to modernize the company's outdated systems. Daniel remembered those meetings clearly. Victor constantly questioned the architecture. Why is this system so centralized around one architect? Why is there no simplified override layer? Why does the governance system have authority over executive decisions? At the time Daniel thought Victor simply didn't understand the design philosophy. Now he realized something else. Victor hadn't wanted to understand it. He wanted it removed. Back in the present, Daniel scrolled through the report. The governance monitor had been quietly tracking something for months. A chain of decisions that looked harmless individually. But together, they formed a pattern. Stock buybacks. Internal restructuring. Silent asset reallocation. All timed around one major event. Daniel's termination. Daniel whispered to himself. You weren't replacing the system. He opened another file. The system automatically linked the decisions to their projected financial outcome. Daniel stared at the result. Then he understood. Victor hadn't been modernizing the company. He had been preparing to strip it. Inside headquarters, the crisis had reached a new level. The operations center was now working under emergency protocols. Engineers were attempting to map the system faster than it could reveal itself. One of the consultants pointed to a new alert. What's this? The engineer leaned over. Governance escalation. The consultant frowned. That's the thing analyzing the board, right? Yes. And it just triggered something. What kind of something? The engineer read the message slowly. Executive decision integrity review complete. The consultant swallowed. Complete? The engineer nodded. Which means the system finished its analysis. What happens now? The engineer pointed at the next line appearing on the screen. Disclosure protocol preparing. The consultant blinked. Disclosure of what? The engineer looked at him. I think the system is about to expose something. Upstairs, the boardroom had grown tense again. Victor paced while the chairman argued with the consultants over speakerphone. This is unacceptable, the chairman snapped. You're telling me the system is auditing us? The consultant's voice came through the speaker. Not exactly. Then what exactly is it doing? It's reviewing leadership actions against the company's operational mission. Victor scoffed. That's ridiculous. The consultant hesitated. Well, it was designed to detect destabilizing leadership behavior. Victor rolled his eyes. So it's judging management decisions. Yes. Victor shook his head dismissively. Then disable it. The consultant didn't respond immediately. Finally he said. We can't. Why not? Because the governance monitor has higher authority than any executive account. Victor frowned. That makes no sense. The consultant answered calmly. It does if the system was designed to protect the company from its leadership. Across the city, Daniel had returned to his apartment. He sat at his desk reviewing the report. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. Victor had been slowly redirecting corporate assets, preparing the company for a forced restructuring that would transfer massive value to a small group of investors, and Daniel had been the only obstacle. Because the governance system would have flagged the pattern immediately if it had remained intact. So Victor did the only thing he could. He convinced the board that Daniel, and the system he built, had to go. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Now everything made sense. The firing. The consultants. The rush to modernize the infrastructure. They hadn't wanted efficiency. They wanted control. But they had made one critical mistake. They thought removing Daniel would disable the system. They never realized something Daniel had built years earlier. A safeguard buried deeper than the governance layer. A protocol that activated only if leadership tried to bypass the system entirely. Daniel looked at the final line of the report. Disclosure protocol ready. He whispered quietly. You found it. Back at headquarters, every screen in the operations center suddenly flickered. Engineers looked up. New notifications appeared across the system simultaneously. Finance servers. Client databases. Executive dashboards. Even the boardroom display. The chairman stared at the screen. What is this? The operations director read the message slowly. Executive transparency protocol initiated. Victor's face went pale. What does that mean? The director looked at the expanding report on the screen. I think. He swallowed. The system just exposed the board. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time the call came from an unknown number. He answered. A voice spoke immediately. You need to get here. Daniel recognized it instantly. One of the senior engineers. What happened? The engineer sounded stunned. The system just dumped 8 months of executive activity logs across the internal network. Daniel stood slowly. And? The engineer hesitated. Victor Hale is finished. At 9:42 p.m., every executive screen in the company changed at the same time. Boardroom monitors. Operations dashboards. Internal executive tablets. Even the private leadership portal. All of them displayed the same message. Executive transparency protocol active. Below it, a report began compiling in real time. Emails. Authorization logs. Internal financial decisions. 8 months of executive activity stitched together into a single timeline. Inside the boardroom, no one spoke. The chairman stared at the screen. What is this? The operations director answered quietly. The governance system compiled a full leadership audit. Victor Hale stood frozen. This has to be a mistake. But the report kept expanding. Every major decision Victor had pushed since joining the company began appearing in sequence. Department restructuring approvals. Asset reallocations. Emergency override attempts. Stock purchase authorizations tied to outside investment firms. The chairman leaned closer to the screen. Victor, why are these decisions linked to offshore holding groups? Victor's voice tightened. They're standard investment vehicles. The finance director shook his head slowly. No, they're not. Another page appeared. Projected post-restructuring control transfer. Victor's strategy plan appeared in full. It wasn't modernization. It was disassembly. Within 6 months, the company's core infrastructure and intellectual property would have been transferred to a newly formed holding structure controlled by Victor and several outside investors. The company itself would remain operational. But hollowed out. A shell. The chairman turned slowly. You were planning to strip the company. Victor didn't answer. Another log appeared. This one from the executive meeting 3 weeks earlier. The meeting where Daniel Mercer had first been discussed. The transcript appeared word for word. Victor's voice filled the room through the playback. The governance system gives Mercer too much control over operational authority. Another line followed. If we want flexibility in restructuring, we need to remove that system. The chairman whispered. You targeted Daniel. Victor finally snapped. Because he built a system that answers to no one. The room went silent. Victor pointed at the screens around them. This proves it. That system just exposed internal leadership data without authorization. The operations director spoke calmly. No. It exposed corruption. Victor laughed bitterly. You think shareholders care about that? The chairman looked at him with something close to disgust. They will when regulators see this. Down in the operations center, engineers were watching the same report unfold. One of them leaned back slowly. Holy hell. Another whispered. Daniel built a whistleblower system. The senior consultant corrected him. No. He pointed to the architecture map. He built a corporate immune system. Across the city, Daniel Mercer sat quietly in his apartment watching the same report on his laptop. He had never expected the disclosure protocol to activate. It was designed as a final safeguard. Something that would only trigger if the governance system detected a coordinated attempt to override corporate stability. Which meant one thing. Victor had pushed harder than Daniel realized. Daniel scrolled through the report. Then he saw something that made him pause. A new message from the system. Governance review complete. Below it was a simple system summary. Primary threat identified, Victor Hale. Secondary threat identified, executive negligence. Operational stability risk, high. And below that, one final recommendation. Root architect intervention advised. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The system wasn't asking him to fix the company. It was asking him to decide its future. Back in the boardroom, the crisis had shifted completely. Victor was no longer pacing. He was sitting down, pale, staring at the screen. The chairman stood slowly. This ends tonight. Victor looked up sharply. You think removing me fixes anything? The chairman didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Claire. Call Daniel. Claire nodded. This time there was no hesitation. No pride. No negotiation strategy. Just necessity. She dialed the number. Across the city, Daniel's phone rang again. He looked at the screen. Claire Whitaker. For a moment he considered letting it ring again. But this time. He answered. Daniel, Claire said immediately. Yes. We know everything now. I assumed you would. Claire's voice was steady. Victor is finished. Daniel said nothing. We need you to come back. Daniel looked at the laptop screen displaying the system's final prompt. The company he built. The people who betrayed him. The corruption the system had uncovered. All of it sitting on the edge of collapse. Claire spoke again. Daniel. The company can't survive this without you. Daniel finally responded. Actually. He closed the laptop slowly. It can. Claire held her breath. But not the way you think. Inside the headquarters building, the operations center screens changed again. Another system message appeared. Root architect decision pending. Every engineer in the room stared at the screen. Because the system had just done something unprecedented. It had handed control back to the one person who built it. And whatever Daniel Mercer decided next would determine whether the company survived the night. The headquarters building had never been this quiet. Not during mergers. Not during financial crises. Not even during the company's early years when survival depended on landing a single contract. Now the silence came from something far more unsettling. The entire company was waiting for one person. In the operations center, engineers stood around the alert wall staring at a single message glowing in white text. Root architect decision pending. No timers. No countdown. Just a waiting system. In the boardroom, the atmosphere felt heavy. Victor Hale sat at the far end of the table, surrounded by silent executives who now refused to look at him. The chairman leaned toward Claire. Has Daniel said anything? Claire shook her head slowly. He said he's thinking. Victor scoffed quietly. That means he's enjoying this. The chairman didn't respond. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew something uncomfortable. Daniel Mercer had earned this moment. Across the city, Daniel stood in his apartment looking at the skyline. The company headquarters tower stood tall among the lights. 20 years of his life had gone into that building. 20 years of building systems no one else fully understood. He walked back to his desk. His laptop screen still displayed the system prompt. Root architect intervention available. Below it were two options. Restore executive authority. Or activate structural reform. Daniel stared at the options. The first would unlock the system. Everything would resume. Operations. Finance. Logistics. The board would regain control. The company would survive. But the same leadership structure that allowed Victor to nearly dismantle the company would still exist. The second option was something Daniel had written years ago but never believed he'd use. A contingency protocol. One that would fundamentally change how the company operated. He opened the documentation. Structural reform protocol. The system would unlock operations. But executive control would be redistributed. Key authority would shift to an automated governance structure requiring multi-level verification from engineering, finance, and operational leadership. The board would still exist. But it would no longer be able to override the system unilaterally. In other words, the company would never again be able to remove the system that protected it. Daniel leaned back. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. He hovered the cursor over the second option. Then clicked. At that exact moment, every screen inside headquarters changed. In the operations center, engineers looked up. A new message appeared, structural reform protocol activated. The system immediately began unlocking subsystems. Logistics routing restored. Financial validation resumed. Client authentication reopened. Orders began processing again. Shipment queues cleared. Within seconds, the company's digital ecosystem began breathing again. But one part of the system remained locked. Executive authority. Upstairs in the boardroom, the chairman stared at the display. What just happened? The operations director spoke slowly. Operations are back online. Relief spread across the room. Then the director kept reading. But executive control permissions have changed. Victor frowned. What does that mean? The director zoomed into the permission structure. Every executive account had been downgraded. The board no longer had override access. Major system decisions now required distributed authorization from multiple operational leaders. Victor's face went pale. You're telling me the system just took power away from the board? The director nodded. Yes. The chairman whispered. Daniel rewrote the company. Across the building, employees were watching the same system message appear across their screens. New governance structure active. The message ended with a simple line. Operational stability must never depend on a single leader. Back in his apartment, Daniel closed his laptop. His phone rang one final time. Claire. He answered. Well? She asked. The system is stable. Yes. And the company is still running. Yes. Claire paused. Then asked the question she already knew the answer to. What did you do? Daniel looked out at the skyline. I made sure the company can't be hijacked again. Another silence. Then Claire asked softly. And you? What about me? Are you coming back? Daniel smiled faintly. No. Claire seemed surprised. Why not? Daniel gave the simplest answer of the night. Because the system doesn't need me anymore. He ended the call. The next morning, news broke across the industry. The company had survived a major overnight crisis. But something else had changed. The company now operated under one of the most advanced governance architectures ever built. A system designed not just to run infrastructure, but to protect the company itself. Analysts called it revolutionary. Competitors called it terrifying. Inside headquarters, engineers had a simpler name for it. Mercer's Law. A principle now written permanently into the system's core. A company should never depend on the people who might destroy it. Weeks later, Daniel walked into a small office across town. A new startup. A small team. A single server rack waiting in the corner. The young founder greeted him nervously. Mr. Mercer, we're honored you agreed to help. Daniel smiled. Call me Daniel. The founder gestured toward the empty rack. We want to build something big. Daniel looked at the hardware. Then at the city skyline through the window. He had heard those words once before. But this time, he planned to build something even better.